Hey everybody. In this video, I'm going to walk you through the first half of Book 1 of the Nicomachean Ethics. I'm going to stick much closer to the text with Aristotle than I did with Plato. The reason being that Plato is much easier to read than Aristotle. It's not necessarily that Plato is easier to understand. There's a whole lot of stuff going on in Plato, a whole lot of sort of dramatic tricks being used that to complicate his meaning. And there are some obscure sections of Plato, certainly, but there's nothing like the kind of denseness and unnecessary and even harmful brevity the kind you get with Aristotle. It can be very hard to read Aristotle on your own. I'm not going to go line by line. I'm not going to comment on everything he says because that would just take too long. I am, however, going to walk you through so you have an idea of what's going on in each chapter. Because the way this is broken down, you see here on the screen, you have Book 1, Chapter 1, Chapter 2. We're going to go through Chapter 6 in this video. And I'll make a second video for the second half of the book starting at Chapter 7. I want to leave you with an idea of the main points from each little chapter. Okay, and in so doing, I'm going to, or in the process of doing that, I'm going to from time to time expand on what he says. I'm going to talk about some of the implications of what he says. I'm also going to talk about the relationship between what Aristotle was talking about and what Plato talked about. So part of the reason to spend as much time on Plato as we did was in order to give you a good foundation to talk about Aristotle. When we're done with Plato and Aristotle, we'll have the virtue ethics theory, or the theory of virtue ethics, laid out, not entirely, because it's continued to develop over the last 2,500 years, but Plato and Aristotle are where it begins, and they are still thought by most people to be the most important practitioners of it. All right, so let's start with Chapter 1. This is really, really short. The main point here is that Aristotle is going to say that goods are hierarchically arranged. So he says every art and every inquiry, and every action and every pursuit. We'll just lump those all together under activities. Every activity is aimed at some good. Like there's a point to doing it. For everything you do, there's a point to doing it. There's something you want to achieve by it. However, he introduces a distinction here. But there's a certain difference found among ends. Some are activities, others are products apart from the activities that produce them. This is a pretty straightforward point. Sometimes you do what you do just because you want to do it, right? So some activities, the point of doing them is that the activity itself is good. But sometimes you do an activity, you engage in an activity only for what results from it. So as an example of the first thing, laying out on a hammock, right? You do that just to do it. You're not trying to produce anything by it. You do it because you enjoy it. You enjoy the relaxation. You enjoy the sunshine. Unless, you're a weird kind of person who likes to lay out in a hammock in the rain, which, okay. But some things, like going to the dentist, you only do because of the result of that activity. You don't enjoy the activity itself, right? So that's the only point being made there. And what Aristotle is going to say is that, so for each activity, there's a goal or an end. And that's the good that the activity is aimed at. Sometimes that goal or activity is the activity, or the goal of the activity is the activity itself. Sometimes it's something else. He says when it's something else, that means the goal, the product, is better than the activity itself. So clean teeth, a healthy mouth, is better than going to the dentist. But then he makes the point that while this is true, while every activity has its own good that goes along with it, right? Because the goal to be achieved is the good associated with that activity. While that's true, it's not like all we can say about the good is that, there's a good for every activity. Because then if you were going to say something about the good, it would just be like a list, the goals of each activity you engage in. And that's not how it is. How it is, the way things are, is that there's plenty of activities that you perform only to service some larger activity. So the example he gives is that bridle making and other arts concerned with the equipment of horses fall under the art of riding. Right? So we only engage in the activities of making bridles, of making horseshoes, of doing things like this in order to facilitate the activity of riding. So activities are sort of hierarchically ordered. So I'll go to the here, right? So what we have is you have, let's say, activity A and activity B, and they're both in service of activity C. A here in his example might be like bridle making. B would be an example I used, the shoeing of a horse. They're there to facilitate riding, but riding, he's going to say, is there to facilitate generalship. But riding's not the only thing that facilitates generalship. So Aristotle's idea here is learning how to become a good horse rider, a good rider of a horse, a good equestrian. The point of that is to become better at war, which means it's all in the service of running a good military campaign, which is the art of generalship. But riding isn't the only thing, right? You might think calisthenics is something else like that. So you have another activity that feeds into D, where D is generalship. And there are things that go into calisthenics. There's like healthy eating, stuff like that. The point is that activities and the goods that are produced by them are arranged hierarchically. Right? It's not just a mess. There's a structure to the activities we engage in. The way this ends up going is that the higher up the pyramid you go, right? So the more valuable the activity or the products of the activity get, right? Which suggests that if you go all the way to the top of the pyramid, maybe you'll find the ultimate good, and that's what chapter 2 is going to be about. All right, so here's chapter 2. The beginning of chapter 2 is, believe it or not, one of the most heavily debated parts of this book. Because, as is very common throughout this book, Aristotle's very unclear, and he opens himself up to multiple possible interpretations. And these different interpretations have incredibly significant consequences, and just different consequences for how to read the rest of the book. I'm going to give you what I take to be the best interpretation, the one that makes the most sense out of Aristotle, the one that makes his theory not crazy. But I'll let you know what the alternative interpretation is. All right, so starts out saying, if then there is some end of the things we do, which we desire for its own sake, everything else being desired for the sake of this, and if we do not choose everything for the sake of something else, for at that rate the process would go on to infinity so that our desire would be empty and vain. Clearly this must be the good and the chief good. All right, this is the passage. This is the passage that has caused a great deal of debate. So what's going on? What's going on is that Aristotle is considering two possibilities, right? So I'm going to erase this earlier pyramid. He's considering one possibility, according to which we have these hierarchically arranged activities and goods, right? So we have, let's do again, activity A, right, which is in the service of activity B, and maybe, activity C is also in the service of B. It's not going to matter the order in which we have these letters appear. One possibility, B is in service of D, and D is in service of E, right? And F is in service of D. One possibility is that this just goes on forever. One possibility is that for everything we do it for some reason, for some goal, other than the activity itself, and that this just goes on forever. And to make clear what I mean by that, think about what you're doing now, right? You're taking a class, you're taking a college class. You're taking it, many of you, because of some requirement, right? Some of you are taking it as an elective. But you're doing it to graduate in some way. In the loosest possible sense, it's a requirement because you got to get to 120 credits, right? And this is 3. So you're engaging in this act of watching this video in order to do well in the class. And you want to do well in the class because you want to make sure at the very least you pass the class. And you want to contribute to a good GPA. You're doing that so that you can graduate and maybe graduate with a good overall GPA. You're doing that so you can get a job. You want the job so you can get money. You want the money so you can buy stuff. You want the stuff in order to, I don't know, have some fun. You want to have some fun because you need a distraction from how terrible your job is, right? You need a distraction from how terrible your job is because if you kept going on every day, only focused on work, you might lose your mind. And so on and so forth. Everything you do, it's for something else, and it never ends. You don't ever get to a point where you just say, stop, I'm doing this because it's just good. I'm not doing it because it's good to get something else. I'm doing it because it's just good. Aristotle considers the possibility that maybe this just goes on forever, but he rules it out. He rules it out because he says, if that were the case, our desire would be empty and vain. So Aristotle seems to be suggesting that if this process goes on forever, then there'd be something irrational about our whole life, right? That if there wasn't some ultimate good, some highest good that everything else was in service of, then everything we did in life would be pointless. That without a highest good, life would just be, well, as he says, empty and vain, wasted, worthless, pointless. Right? So he says there's a highest good. So the way this would work is, let's say E is the highest good. I actually set it up to be E because E stands for eudaimonia, which is what he's going to say the highest good is. But that was just a little trick. Right, so the idea is everything we do is in service of the highest good. So that our life is arranged like this. Everything we do, as long as it's rational, right? Because sometimes we just waste time. We do irrational things. So that when people ask you why you're doing it, you have no idea, right? Like if you're walking along and you just stop and you look around and people say, "Why'd you stop?" And you're like, "I don't know. I just did." Sometimes you do stuff like that. That action, those kinds of activities are not in service of anything. The idea is when you're being rational, when you're doing things for a reason, then ultimately it's all in service of the highest good, right? And that you could imagine your life and all the things you do in it being arranged this way. So this raises the big issue. So thus far, there's no question. There's no interpretive dispute because everybody agrees that Aristotle thinks there's a highest good. The question is going to be, what is the highest good? And the dispute is about whether the highest good is an inclusive good or whether it is, I'll say, a unified good. The idea here is that it seems like there's more than one thing in life that you want for its own sake. Because the idea is that the highest good is going to be something you want for its own sake. There's nothing else you want it for, right? There's no arrow coming from E here to point towards something else. Because when you get to E, whatever E is, you just have reached what you want, right? You've reached the thing that's just good. It's presumably going to be some kind of activity. Aristotle's going to end up saying it's a kind of activity. At this point, he's open, or at least he's left it open, to the idea that it could be a product. It could be, the result of an activity. But either way, you get to a point, Aristotle thinks, where you have it, right? You have achieved the good thing. You have gotten the good thing. You've done or gotten the good thing, and that's it, right? So that when someone asks you, well, why are you doing this, right? Why do you want this thing? Why are you doing this kind of thing? You just say, because it's good, right? Not because it helps me get something else that I want. It's just because all on its own, it's worth having. So the question then becomes, is this the same thing for everybody? And is it just one thing? Right? Because it seems like there's more than one thing in your life that is valuable in itself, that has what we'll call final goodness. We introduced this concept a little bit with Plato, The idea is that whatever the highest good is, I won't use an arrow, I'm using arrows too much here. The highest good, highest because it's at the top of this pyramid, the highest good is a final good, meaning that it's not just a tool to get something else. It's not just being used to achieve something else. One thing you could think, and this would be to say that the highest good is a unified good, is there's only one thing that can count as the final good. There's one thing that everything we do is in service of. An example of that, we've seen an example of that in this course, with Plato. In the Protagoras, Plato defends hedonism. Hedonism is the view that pleasure is, and here, I'll move it over a little bit. Pleasure is the good. According to hedonism, Aristotle's correct. There's a highest good, and that good is pleasure. What we do everything for when we're being rational is to experience pleasure. On that view, there's only one good thing in life ultimately, and everything else in life that's good is only good because it helps you get pleasure. That would be to think of the highest good as a unified good. There are people who think Aristotle believes the highest good is a unified good. The alternative is to say that the highest good is an inclusive good. It's supposed to be a C. And what does that mean? Well, if the highest good is an inclusive good, it means that the structure of your life isn't a single pyramid in a sense, right? So we could say we have A, B, and C. It's almost certainly going to be more than just three things, but bear with me. I want to keep it a little simple. And the idea is everything in life is devoted towards final goods, but there's multiple things that serve as final goods. I'm not going to draw the whole thing here. Take too long, but you get the idea. Everything in life is in this hierarchical ordering. I just said I'm not going to finish it, but I can't let myself stop. There we go. But if the highest good were a unified good, that would demand that there was something above A, B, and C here, right, that needed to go there, that A, B, and C were all in pursuit of, that you did whatever A, B, and C were in order to get that. But if the highest good is an inclusive good, then what Aristotle has in mind is that the highest good is just the name we give to everything on the top row. There can be different things on the top row. There can be lots of things that have final goodness. And the highest good is just that level, in a sense. It's all the good things put together. What I think is clear from the text, if you read carefully and read thoroughly, is that the highest good for Aristotle is an inclusive good, not a unified good. That Aristotle is going to say, yeah, there's lots of things that are good in life. And what the highest good is just having all those things as much as you can, right? Consistent with each other. Because it seems possible that, like, let's say A is pleasure, right? Let's say that's pleasure. And let's say that's, and here I'll anticipate something he's going to say in just a little bit. Contemplation, and this is public virtue. It's open to Aristotle to say, yeah, all of those things are good, right? Living a public life in which you behave virtuously, behave well, living a life where you contemplate things, living a life that's full of pleasure, all these things are worthwhile. They all feed into the a good life. But the idea is there's going to be trade-offs, right? Because the kind of things that give you pleasure might get in the way of contemplation. Like if you want to get drunk every night because it's fun, that gets in the way of reading, interesting books and stuff like that. If you're spending all your time studying, that might get in the way of living sort of a public life, right? Scholars tend to be kind of hermits. I'm recording this during the period of the coronavirus, and right now, I'm doing fine. My day goes almost the same way it always does, where I just sit at home and I read my books. I don't live a life of public virtue because I'm devoting all my time towards contemplation. So there's going to be trade-offs, is the point. If the highest good is an inclusive good, there's going to be some trade-offs. But the idea is all the things that are good in themselves are going to be put together in the highest good. I want to make you aware that there's a dispute here. I think there's a correct answer in this dispute. I think Aristotle believes in an inclusive good, not a unified good. But it's out there. And we'll come back to pleasure, public virtue, and contemplation very shortly. So at this point, Aristotle is committed to there being a highest good, but he's not committed to there being just one good thing. So it's not like he has a theory like hedonism. Hedonism says there's only one good thing in life. That's pleasure. Aristotle's not going to suggest, at least the way I'm interpreting him and the way I'm teaching him to you, he's not going to suggest that there's just one good thing, but it's something else besides pleasure, because as we're going to see, Aristotle's not a hedonist. Instead, the best way to read him, I'm claiming, is that there's a bunch of good things. And they're not all good because there's some distinct thing that they're all in pursuit of. They're all good on their own, which means the highest good, the thing we're searching for, is a life that has as much of those things as possible. All right. He then goes on to say it's important to know what the highest good is if we're going to try to get it, right? We need to have something to aim at if we're going to try to, go after it. And then he considers, how do we go about getting it? How do we go about figuring out what is the highest good, right? And he says the science that's appropriate for this is political science. The thing to keep in mind here is that political science back then means something different than it does now. So if you're a political scientist now, you're studying political institutions. You're studying human political behavior. You're trying to make predictions about how people will behave in political situations, political contexts, within political institutions. You're trying to predict how political institutions will have an influence on each other and have an influence on the outcome of like campaigns and things like that. What political science meant for Aristotle was the science devoted towards the good rule of a city. Right? Political comes from the word polis, which is Greek for city. And Aristotle, when he's talking about political science, is talking about everything that goes into making decisions about how to run a city. The reason why this is going to be the science that tells us what's good is because political science rules over everything. Everything that happens in a city, or to put it more broadly, in society, is part of the purview of political science. So presumably everything that's good in life is going to be something that political science studies. Right? This is called the Nicomachean Ethics, but according to Aristotle, it's actually a work of political science.